Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Stream. As you'll note already by this being a premiere rather than a live episode, this was pre recorded on Friday, the 15th of this month. That way, all of you could have something to just listen to and look at on your Easter Sunday for many of you. If you're not a Christian, then it's just a regular Sunday for you. And for those of you who are celebrating Easter right now, please pray for the rest of us. Pascha is next week, so we're just a week behind. But today I am joined by Hunger, a wonderful friend and patron of the channel who has some wonderful on the ground and personal, intimate familiarity with the subject we're talking about today. He's been on before to discuss Lebanon. But Hunger, how are you?
I'm great. How you doing?
I cannot complain. I've got my cup of coffee in front of me, my show notes, and let's just dig into it then. So, what kind of triggered all of this was reading some Telegram news stuff and news feeds about how some of the most recent wheat imports in Lebanese ports actually went bad. The last bit of Ukrainian wheat that they had imported was too heavily moisturized to be usable. So the food crisis is already very real for Lebanon. Most of their imports do come from Ukraine, and the war, obviously, now for the last almost 2 months, has made the food crisis a very real problem, not just in the Middle East, but as I pointed out on this channel earlier, it's going to affect the World Food Program in the entire continent of Africa. But that's just one drop in the bucket to what we're going to discuss. But I thought that the food issue would be the best place to start because, as you had mentioned to me before we went on air, most of people in Lebanon aren't looking at this as with the backdrop of the war. They're looking at it explicitly in terms of the government.
Oh, definitely. So we're all a bit tired of talking about Ukraine and Russia, but that's definitely having an impact on the situation. But there are many factors, or a host of factors behind I guess the best way to say is the food insecurity that's happening in Lebanon right now. Ukraine is absolutely one of those key factors. As you said, 80% of Lebanon's grain did come from Ukraine. But at the same time, this is a consequence of a lot of government policies. Lebanon is in a very dire financial situation right now. It's currently negotiating with the IMF for about $3 to $4 billion in loans. And so we don't have the finances now for imports. It's very, very stretched. So what's happening with the food situation is that the government has been subsidizing wheat. It's been subsidizing the price of this, subsidizing imports because there's a shortage of dollars, and dollars are required to pay for imports like wheat. And at the same time as well, they're subsidizing the price of wheat. They're they're fixing the price of bread inside the country. And so you're having the situation where the wheat is being subsidized and the bread is being fixed. There's a price ceiling on the bread. And so on the ground, no one is talking about Ukraine as the issue. People are talking about it as an economic crisis because bakeries don't know what the price of bread will be, because on the black market the currency is fluctuating, and the currency is fluctuating all the time. The Lebanese lira versus the dollar, it's currently now 25,000 lira per dollar, and we've been having 2 years of hyperinflation. If you go back 2 years ago, the lira was 1,500 to the dollar. And so that's lost 90+% of its value in 2 years. And the government is still trying to keep that price stable, keep the price of bread stable, because that would be like almost literally a 1,500% increase in the price of bread if it followed the black market rate. So the government has been slowing that down, first by subsidizing the wheat imports, and second by fixing the price of bread at home. And so bread shortage is the consequence of this price fixing and these imports subsidies. So what the basic economics will tell you, that if the price of bread is not reflecting the market rate, what you make up for in price, you make up for in shortage, or you make up for in time, in supply or time.
Yeah, and I mean it's good to point out that it's not just an explicitly Ukraine-Russia war conflict. I had noticed when I was doing some show notes for this that the price of bread has gone up over 20% in Lebanon since October of 2021. So long before the conflict had started, you had already seen issues with wheat primarily due to, like you had mentioned, price controls as well as hyperinflation. And this does feel very reminiscent to what the last time that you were on discussing issues within Lebanon about government management of things such as energy. The last time you and I had talked on this subject, we were dealing with issues, of course, of electrical shortages and rationing, which also had affected food because of the amount of power you needed to run your bakery. So I can only imagine that this has only exacerbated that situation as well.
Absolutely. So the update on from the last stream about the fuel situation is it has actually improved because they've dropped the subsidy for fuel, or they've dropped it significantly. And so I wouldn't say it's exactly aligned to the black market rate in terms of in terms of liras per, I guess, tank of fuel. But the government has allowed the price to rise, and the government has removed the majority of its subsidies on fuel. And surprise, surprise, the next day there was fuel in the gas stations because these merchants and traders and business people were hoarding fuel. The fuel was actually still in the country, but no one was willing to sell it because no one could make a profit on it. It was a giant money losing operation if you wanted to sell gasoline at these fixed prices. And so, surprise, surprise, the next day after the subsidies are lifted, people have gasoline in the gas stations now. And so that situation is repeating itself with bread, with the bread crisis and the food crisis. There is kind of imported wheat. There is you can't discount the supply chain issue. There is absolutely a supply chain issue related to Ukraine. But at the same time, this has been going on for months now. Like the shortage has gotten particularly bad now. But if you go, when I was there recently, I was there in December. You could find bread, but there was a queue for bread, and it was being somewhat rationed because it was still being fixed. And so it's just been exacerbated by the Ukraine situation, and many countries are experiencing that. Whatever problems these countries have now in terms of food security will get worse. It might not be the leading cause, but in many cases, it will absolutely be a factor.
Well, it's one heck of a time to do that, considering Lent as well as I believe Ramadan is also happening. So, I mean,
Yeah,
if there's a dark humor to be made, I guess that would be the time to do it, as while everyone's fasting.
yeah. Oh,
But yeah,
yes.
but I mean, it also sort of illustrates something that we've also talked about on the channel before, is just that the food issue is going to be a problem that we're going to see in the Middle East as well as in Africa. Iran had faced riots because of inflation, but also due to food issues. And I had mentioned already on this channel that the World Food Program gets a significant amount of its wheat and grain imports from both Russia and Ukraine, which has now been disrupted due to not only the conflict, but international sanctions. And Hunger was kind enough to share this, which was the World Food Program Lebanon in review type deal here. I wonder if I can just fit to page. Oh, that's awful. Let's go zoom in real quick. But yeah, this is from the World Food Program in 2021. This was some recent stuff. So as you can see on the right here on the screen, it does show that 2.1 million people are going to be considered at risk or vulnerable to food insecurity. So 46% of Lebanese already are food insecure. And this is, of course, using the UN's definition for it. But to start from the top here, Lebanon is facing its third year of dramatic economic crisis, political paralysis, and heightened social tensions, and the ongoing negative effects of COVID-19 and the 2020 Beirut port explosion. The human impact of these crises are sobering. In 2021, both Lebanese and refugees suffered a high level of poverty, food insecurity. 2.1 Lebanese and 1.3 million Syrian refugees are vulnerable and in need of assistance. And in response, the United Nations World Food Program supported 2.1 million of the most vulnerable of both of these populations to meet their essential needs through food, cash transfers, and in-kind food support assistance. And I think that that's a good thing to also mention is that Lebanon, by geographic proximity, its relationship, of course, with Hezbollah, the country, and their position within Syria, as well as being against Israel, that millions of Syrian refugees have gone really in two directions, and it's been mainly either to Turkey through Europe, or it's been to Lebanon, just conveniently right next door into its neighbors. So I wouldn't be surprised that this exacerbates some of the tensions that are on the ground.
Absolutely. And if you look at a map of Syria, the Turkey and Lebanon are very close to major population centers, which is why people aren't fleeing to Iraq or Jordan from Syria. And yeah, if you look at this again, like on this chart, you can see it says 46% of Lebanese. That would have been pre 2019. That would have been about 15%. And so we can see that this food aid that's been coming from the WFP has more and more been increasingly towards Lebanese populations and not towards refugees. Pre 2019, the majority of this aid was for refugees, and it was like almost unheard of to support the Lebanese citizens themselves. And now that's what we see occurring here. And as it says, there's about 1.3 million Syrians, and there's another 500,000 Palestinians. So that's almost 2 million people out of a country of 5 million. That's and that's at risk of food insecurity and putting a strain on resources, putting a strain on the demand for food, the demand for energy, the demand for shelter. All of these things have to be provided for these 2 million people that are not citizens of the state.
Yeah, and I mean even here, although this is from last year, their 2022 plan, which I'm sure this has probably changed since the war started in February, but it's almost 50-50, almost a million here, a little over a million for the refugees. It's been split almost evenly in half here, which to me kind of just shows that what government management can do to affect the way you provide services to your people, like you were talking about with price caps.
Absolutely. And you have to recognize we talked about this in the previous stream, which is almost a year ago, that Lebanon is an oligarchy. It's an extremely corrupt oligarchy, that it's a sectarian-based system, and so the government is divided between the different sects and between half Christian, half Muslim, even though the demographics don't reflect the population. The population is not half Christian, half Muslim. It's about 2/3 to a quarter Muslim and 1/3 to a quarter Christian. And so that's why so much of this incompetence from the government is based not on meritocracy, but on the sectarian division of the pie. And so you're going in any of these cases, you're going to get mismanagement. You're going to get people looking out for their own group and not for the citizen of the country.
And I mean that sectarian issue. I mean, of course, there's the historical animosity, of course, between ethnic and religious groups inside the region. Lord knows that the Middle East is filled with it, both from influences of the West and domestic religious issues. But Lebanon is also a special case because its sectarian representation in government is directly an impact from the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990. And there was an agreement that had came out of that that sort of set the standard for political representation between uh, Muslim and Christian groups inside the country. And to this day, I know that that still plays a major role in how that pie is divvied up and how elections play out, because it is an oligarchy, but it's still, what is democracy but laundered oligarchy, right? So
Exactly.
um,
Yeah, so it actually was a sectarian system before the Civil War, whereas the Civil War exacerbated, and there was a shift in the balance of power internally between Muslim groups and Christian groups. But it was always a sectarian system ever since we gained independence from the French post World War II.
Yes, and I think that kind of gives us a good point, because you and I were talking about setting this stream up, and you had mentioned that you're going to be there close during the elections, which are this May. And all of these things are going to bubble over, not just for the domestic politics, but it's the Sunday stream. We'll talk about the geopolitical ramifications. But when we talk about the food crisis and the economy, the issue, of course, always brings up the fact that the country itself is nearing bankruptcy or already is bankrupt. So I was taking a look at some of the news reels from Lebanese sources, and on the 3rd of April, the deputy prime minister, Al Shami, had said that the state and central bank are bankrupt. And at the same time, this led to an immediate sort of rebuking from the governor of the Lebanese central bank, saying that it's going to continue to maintain their monthly obligations. And even the deputy prime minister later that week had made a correction, saying that that was taken out of context. So however, there were numerous, political commentators, professors, and industrialists in the country that had stated that around the first week of April that the country either is bankrupt or it's going to be imminent, and that this is going to have an impact not only on how the government provides services, but also how those services are going to impact, like we had just mentioned, the millions of refugees that are in the country. Um, and there had already been some prominent industrialists I was reading that are very much pro Bashar al-Assad in the area, talking about how this may affect Lebanon's economy due to sanctions issues about freezing Syrian accounts in the country. I mean, al-Assad in 2021 had talked about that there are roughly tens of billions of dollars in capital frozen inside Lebanese banks. So I'd imagine that there's going to be quite a bit of spillover between these two issues.
Absolutely. And just on I'll take that step by step. On the finances of the Lebanese state, it's very weird that people say that because the country is, by definition, bankrupt. We defaulted on our foreign debt in 2020, in May of 2020, which was about, I want to say about three to $4 billion. We defaulted on $3 to $4 billion of foreign debt on euro bonds, and that's what started the process of negotiating with the IMF. And so, what we are bankrupt. We don't have the money to pay for those debts, and those debts are accumulating, and that's why we've been negotiating with the IMF for these emergency loans, not just to kickstart the economy again, but because there needs to be fiscal reform, there needs to be central bank reform of these entire sectors because we did default on the debts. The government today is 170% a debt to GDP ratio, 170%, which amounts to about $90 billion. And so over the past 2 years, the economy has just crashed. The economy, it used to be a $50 billion economy, $50 billion GDP. That's shrunk 60% in 2 years. This is literally, according to the World Bank, one of the most severe economic crises since the 19th century. Like, this is the central bank's own words, that this is the worst economic crash we've seen since the 19th century, or one of them. And so the state is literally bankrupt. It's on life support from, God knows where, to be honest. I don't know where they're getting their money from to pay for these subsidies. The reserves of the central bank are diminishing by the day. Pre-crisis, pre-2019 crisis, the central bank had about $60 billion in reserves. And I think as of now, that's gone down to like less than $10 billion in reserves. So it's just an extremely dire situation. And jumping off that to the Syrian economy, the Syrian economy was one of the biggest losers of the Lebanese economic crisis. Like, other than the Lebanese citizens themselves, the Syrians were giant losers of the economic crisis because all those middle class income industrialists from Syria, where their country was ravaged by war, where do they go? Where do they put their money? They put their money in Lebanese banks because they were internationally sanctioned. These were middle class people. These were not billionaires. They put thousands of dollars into the Lebanese banking system. And when the Lebanese banking system collapsed, they lost all their money. There's still capital controls, which means there are limits on how much they can withdraw. I'll give you one example for this. If you have, let's say, $1 million, 1 million liras, Lebanese liras, in the bank, and you want to withdraw that money, the bank will give you 70%, and just that because that's the rate. They can't guarantee that those extra 30%. And so whenever you withdraw from the bank, you're not getting your money. You're getting a cut of your money. So that's an unofficial haircut to save the financial system from total collapse while trying to fulfill their obligation. The bank can't fulfill their obligation, so the depositor has to take a haircut on their savings. And this devastated the Syrians who had trusted the Lebanese banking system, who put their money in this formerly safe haven while their country was ravaged by war. And the immediate effect of that was hyperinflation of the Syrian currency, the hyperinflation of the Syrian lira, because Lebanon was their biggest source for dollars and foreign currency. And once our banking system collapsed, Syria did not have access to foreign currency.
So that sort of brings in the sort of the politics background here, because I know in my research that in 2020 there was an IMF rescue package. I believe it was around 1.4 billion USD, And I know that the Lebanese government is in negotiations about getting another round, most likely far, far more, both from the IMF, but also in foreign assistance from the United States has been their primary area to lobby, and we'll get in on that. But when we talk about the fact that this has been geographically a ground for Syrian refugees, but also the politics about being pro Syria while also trying to maintain a relationship with countries nearby like Israel, and then the overarching influences of greater powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Um, it does sort of bring into question the political stance of where the government might go, especially with these elections. Because last year, I know that, and correct my pronunciation, but I know that the president Michel Aoun in
Alan.
2021, Aoun, okay, Aoun had mentioned that he was open to the idea of opening a common Lebanese Syrian market, sort of EU Schengen style, in order to increase trade and to sort of ease these economic woes, and also to get a better relationship with Al Assad, because it's been now 12 years really since the war in that country had started, both internally and now to what it is today. And Assad is still, relatively in power and has gained most control back from both ISIS and other terror groups linked in the area. So I could see why he'd be open to that. It's just I know that there's also that fine line politically that the Lebanese, sort of the body politic has to play in that role, because there's Syria, and then of course Hezbollah has its own political representation in the country, while Lebanese airspace is being used to conduct anti-Syrian as well as other counterterrorism operations from Israel. So there's so much to sort of unpack there. And I was just wondering what, family, friends, given your time there, what the general mood or the feeling might be today on the Syria question, especially as the two countries are so economically interlinked.
Yeah, just on the geopolitical question, the best way to look at Syrian Lebanese relationships is the same way people see Russian Ukrainian relationships. That most political parties in Ukraine are defined by, are you pro Russia or are you anti Russia? The same is the case in Lebanon, because these were formerly the same country, Syria and Lebanon, pre World War One.
Mm-hmm.
We were the same country, and we were part of the Ottoman Empire, and we were under the French after that. So after the countries were split and gained independence, that Lebanon is an extremely tiny country with a giant neighbor right next door who's far more military, more powerful, far more, I wouldn't say economically more powerful, but has far greater resources and has the potential for a kind of regional influence. Whereas Lebanon is a tiny place that needs soft power, that needs financial power to exert its own influence. And so the political parties in Lebanon are based on whether they are pro-Syria or anti-Syria, or anti-Syria or pro-Western, because the factions of the anti-Syria coalition are supported by Western countries. They're supported by France, America, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, as opposed to the pro-Syrian group, which includes Hezbollah as well as the current president. The current president and his political party is supported by Syria, Iran, and to a lesser extent Russia, because Russia is more of a background player, but supports what Syria and Iran are doing in Lebanon.
Yeah, and on screen I've got the map shared so people can get a better understanding of the geography. I mean, you are surrounded by some of the most contentious geopolitical areas in the Middle East to this day. I mean, to the north, you of course have Turkey, and then the contested, issue over Cyprus, and not too far from you, you also have Syria, Beirut, Israel. I mean, and all of this right in the backdrop of some of the great power politics that are happening in the background, as you had mentioned.
Mhm.
Because I mean, it bears no sort of introduction to know that this area, of course, has seen Syria under civil war now, or in some greater interest of foreign involvement for the last 12 years. We know that Russia is a background player, but is supportive of the Syrian al-Assad regime in the same way that they're supportive of Iran, or having a more, cooling relationship with Iraq, primarily due to Iranian work there. And then, you have the issue of Israel and its existence, although there has been recent moves with the Defense Arab League, and we can get into that. But all of this sort of just shows that the backdrop of how one country can influence the rest, even in ways that aren't seen through foreign aid or military involvement or arms shipment, but also just by existing as a primary neighbor. Proximity will always play a role when we examine these things. It's always something I want to remind the audience is that while we do have these larger players in the background, right? At the end of the day, proximity is always going to play a large role in whatever happens. And like you had mentioned, either you're pro Syria or you're anti Syria with these political parties. Um, the current coalition, the current government with Aoun, what is his stance? Is he pro Syria, anti Syria? I would imagine by these common market propositions he made in last year that he'd be rather pro regime.
Well, this is going to be a little not esoteric, but I'm going to go into some detail about this because, like I said, Syrian Lebanese relationships are extremely similar to Russian Ukrainian relationships in many ways. And so, a very important detail was that the Lebanese Civil War happened in 1975. It lasted for 15 years, and this was a war between Palestinian Muslims, Lebanese Christians, and Lebanese Muslims siding with Palestinians as well. So it was an internal sectarian conflict, but also a Lebanese-Palestinian conflict at the same time. And then the Israelis got involved, and the Syrians also got involved. So everyone kind of genuinely invaded our territory. The Palestinians invaded, the Israelis invaded, and the Syrians invaded. The Syrian invasion was sold as a stabilizing mission to contain the Lebanese Christian and Muslim groups and try to keep a lid on the sectarian conflict. And that was somewhat true, but at the same time not true, because the Assad family being basically established a fiefdom over Lebanon, and so the Syrian army actually occupied Lebanon for 40 years, or 30 years, from 1975 till 2005. As recently as 2005, the Syrian army was still inside Lebanon as a security guarantee, and we basically didn't have a functioning military. We basically had almost no police. Most of the security was established by Syrians, and so that gained a lot of resentment. And I have personal family members who had their cars basically stolen by Syrians who would just come across the border, steal and loot the country from whatever they could go, and flee back to Syria without persecution, without punishment. So there's many justifications for why a large percentage of Lebanese have anti-Syrian feelings. But at the same time, and this culminated in 2005. 2005 was the remarkable seminal year where there was a color revolution. In 2005, the Syrians were kicked out of Lebanon by street protests. There was a million-man street protests in Beirut, as with the support of America, France, and Saudi Arabia. America, France, and Saudi Arabia supported these protests and pressured the Syrians to leave Lebanon. This was after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So Syria was feeling very compelled to follow these U.S. directives. They're like, oh, if you don't leave, well, something's going to happen to Syria. We just invaded Iraq. What are you going to do about it? And so the Syrians went along with that.
This was the Cedar Revolution, right, in 05?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yes. And so the Syrians left, and the immediate political situation after that was pro or anti-Syria. Hezbollah was still around in 2005, and Hezbollah and its allies marched pro-Syria. They wanted Syria to stay in the country during the 2005 revolution, and there was a counter-protest that was also 1 million people large. So this pro-anti-Syrian divide has existed for many years now. And the current president he's very interesting in this regard. Michel Aoun, the current president, was a anti-Syrian political figure that was actually exiled during the Civil War. He came back in 2005 with the protests, supported the protests, and helped to get the Syrians out of the country. But there was an extremely seminal deal 2 years later, in 2007, where Michel Aoun flipped. He flipped to the anti-Syrian camp, and he went to Damascus to meet Bashar al-Assad to finalize this deal, and he had a meeting with the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and they formed a political pact that we are now political allies. Michel Aoun's party is the largest Christian sect party in the country, and he allied with Hezbollah with their pro-Syrian agenda. So it's not surprising now that he wants this economic union with Syria. We're very, very interconnected economies. This is our only neighbor. Like we don't have any trade with Israel. Israel is one blockaded and banned. If you're found with Israeli goods, you can be arrested. So all the Arab countries don't invest or don't have business in Israel, and vice versa. So Syria is our only connection to the rest of the Arab world, just through trade routes, through other things like import export. Another interesting thing about the food crisis was Syria used to produce a lot of grain, and Syria used to be one of our import markets. We used to import Syrian wheat. But ever since the Civil War, that crisis going on in the northeast, which is under the control of Kurdish groups, under the control of US-backed forces, those are the wheat-producing regions of Syria. That's the Syrian breadbasket. And so even if Bashar al-Assad wished to trade wheat with Lebanon, he can't because he doesn't have control over that territory.
It's the
So
same
it's
area that's
starving both.
being fought over by both pro-US Kurdish forces, but it's also being bombed by both the Syrian military, but also the Turkish military as well. So, I mean, this breadbasket you're talking about is also being bombed and attacked constantly. I don't know how. I'm sure the environmental
Absolutely.
impact will be here with us for decades to come.
Yes, but that's cutting off an essential resource of grain from both Syria and Lebanon, because Syria was a wheat exporting country. It wasn't not a huge amount, but it was a net exporter of wheat.
Well, I think that puts important things into context now that you had mentioned that Michel Aoun is a part of the largest Christian party in there, and I think this kind of gives us a good way to sort of let our wheels spin back to sort of the sectarian issue, because we've already talked about the fact that there's not a strong relationship or really non-existent with Israel. Of course, because Hezbollah has a major political influence in the country. It has a political party, despite not winning any aspect of the Cedar Revolution. I guess you had sent me some images about sort of the breakdown of the current the parliamentary system. So I'm going to go share these on here so people can get an idea. So for context, I do know that in that agreement post Civil War, that the political representation of both Christian and Muslim groups had changed. It went from, I think, for every 6 Christians being represented, it's now it was 5 Muslims to now 1-to-1 political representation. And uh, despite the demographics being the way that they are between Christian minority and the Muslim majority, there's still a pretty hefty Christian representation in the country. So let me go share this now. So is there anything that you wanted to comment or provide us some understanding more here for the Parliament?
Yeah. So previously in the early 1930s and 40s, Lebanon, and by on its own, was a majority Christian country. When it was founded, it was still a majority Christian country, where it was about 55% Christian to 45% Muslim. And then as time went on, in the 60s especially, there was a huge spike in the Muslim population, and that destabilized the politics. And so the Muslims were feeling underrepresented, and they were trying to exert political influence and trying to gain more political power, which came to a head with the Lebanese Civil War, as well as the introduction of Palestinian militants that fled Israel and that also fled Jordan. Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was kicked out of Jordan in 1970, and he needed a base to go to. Syria wouldn't accept him, and so the Syrians dumped Yasser Arafat on Lebanon, and he riled up the local Palestinians, and that was one of the key factors that sparked the civil war. And so the post-Civil War consensus was a shifting of the balance of power in the parliament and a shifting of the balance of power between the president and the prime minister. Because we followed the French, we used to be more of a presidential system where the president had the majority of the power, and the president was always supposed to be a Catholic Christian. The president was always a Maronite Catholic, and the prime minister was always a Sunni Muslim. And so the post-Civil War consensus was that power would be transferred from the president onto the prime minister. And so the prime minister became more important politically in the country than the president. And the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament is always a Shiite Muslim. And so currently the Shiites are kind of having a faster birth rate than the Sunnis, and so there's a lot of Sunni Shiite factionalism right now going on between those two because of these demographic issues, because the system is based on sectarianism, based on your position in the government or your position as a power block is based on what religion you are. And so the parliament today is divided 50-50. It's 50% Muslim Christian, while the real demographics are it's more like a third Christian to 2/3 to 1/3 Sunni to 1/3 Shiite, as well as a spattering of other smaller sects.
And this all comes out of that post-Civil War agreement, correct?
Yes.
Okay, because I just going through it, I can see here that parliamentary consultation has to happen before a prime minister is nominated. You can't dismiss or appoint individual ministers at will. I mean, a lot of the presidential power I can see it had been curtailed, and I can see to make it more to be open and inclusive to these, sectarian representations and ratios. But I know that despite this agreement happening in 91, that there's been numerous, militant groups that have just been taking issue with it. I do know, however, that I guess Hezbollah has decided to play the political game and that they've got a political party rather than just operating themselves as just their own independent, militant terror cell that they are. And I think that's also brought up in the other image that you shared with me. So let me share this one instead. So maybe this is a good way to help break it down, because while there is, of course, the 50-50 Christian Muslim split, we can clearly tell here that there's something far different in terms of political parties.
Yes, and this is the visualization of our oligarchy, and we're a multi-party system, so we have all these various parties fighting amongst each other for the same seats. That there are multiple Christian parties that are fighting for control of half the parliament among each other, and there's the pro-Syrian Christians and the anti-Syrian Christians. There's also, to a lesser degree, pro-Syrian Sunnis and anti-Syrian Sunnis, whereas I think, especially after the Civil War, a majority of Sunnis are anti-Syria because they don't like Bashar al-Assad because he's an Alawite. And the Shiites are pretty, I would say, uniform. There's two Shiite parties, but Hezbollah is a very interesting case politically because Hezbollah really, really tries to hide their political power levels. And what I mean by that is they could, if they wanted to, sweep all the Shiite seats and have them all to themselves, and no one would complain about that. But because many countries around the world are concerned about who's in the Lebanese government, that Hezbollah will always be a part of that government. But if Hezbollah brings a larger share of the parliament into that government, that worries Western countries. That worries the European states. That worries the United States. That worries, especially more importantly nowadays, the Gulf states. The Gulf states and Saudi Arabia particularly do not want to see Hezbollah more represented in the Lebanese parliament and more represented in the government. So Hezbollah is very comfortable hiding their power levels, not having as many seats as they could, farming those out to their allies who are also Shiite but not directly a part of Hezbollah. And so that's what's happening in that case. And it's very interesting to see where this next election is, what's going to happen with this election. There are many things to talk about with this election. That's happening on the 15th of May.
And I'm glad that we brought this up because, like you had mentioned, between Hezbollah, the relationship with Syria, and I'm glad that you had mentioned Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states because I wanted to get into that as well. I mean, the election is it's next month. We're recording March, April, May, right? So we're recording on the 15th. It is literally a month from today. And you had sent me some information on this as well, which is definitely worth just reading. That you had mentioned that there are already, several hundred candidates for running. 309 candidates are competing for the 27 seats designated for Sunni Muslims.
Yes,
278 candidates competing for the 34 seats designated for Christian Maronites, and 151 candidates are competing for 27 seats designated for Shia Muslims and so on. I mean, that's insane to think about, considering the already hot political history inside Lebanon. I think I had mentioned this before we went live, but prepping for this, since independence, um, there had been over 200 politically motivated murders and dozens more that were attempted in Lebanon since the end of the Second World War. And I could
correct.
imagine, I'm sure there's probably more, but that's the official number. Um, but I would imagine that in the backdrop of this food crisis, the echoes of what happened 2 years ago with the port explosion and how that impacted the state, that really we're just going to, I really do think that there'll be a lot of escalation in political violence in the area, especially along some of these fault lines that we discussed, not just sectarian, but the inter-religious divides, as well as the Syria and Hezbollah questions as well.
Yeah, political violence is very possible. It's always possible in Lebanon. There's a long history of it. We've had a civil war. We've had political conflicts going on for a very, very long time, and it's always boiling under the surface. Although, if you just ask people in general, no one is willing to fight a civil war, like especially these days. So a lot has changed since 2019 because of the current socio-economic crisis. And and speaking of the election, this is going to be a record election. There's a record number of candidates. There's over 1,000 candidates running for all the seats of parliament. So that's the biggest it's ever been. And there's a record number of independent candidates because everyone knows inside the country the oligarchy is to blame, but no one is capable of removing this oligarchy. So even if you wanted to, if you were a Christian, you can't get rid of your own you can't get rid of your Christian political leadership, even if you wanted to. There's nothing there to replace them. And so what's happening is these independent candidates are flooding the the electoral market, if you want to say it like that. And while at the same time, the political apathy of the general population is skyrocketing. Like the political apathy is reaching a ridiculous level that third world elections are always very, very cynical in that the political leaders have very direct ways of getting their people out to vote, basically bribing them directly or indirectly. I can tell you from personal experience, every election year, the road to my village would be paved before the election. And everyone would know that this would happen during the election year. That, oh, this political party helped fund to pave the road to your village. Therefore, you should support this political party because he did something good for your community. That's an indirect way of bribing a population to vote for you. But it's gotten so cynical now, and the voters are so apathetic that there are literal open discussions of how much are you willing to pay me to vote for you between the voters and the political leadership.
Well, and I think that kind of brings in just the kind of aspects of like foreign money and those stances, right? Because you do mention oligarchy, and we talked about it earlier, that there were numerous like Lebanese businessmen and industrialists that are more pro openly Syria over others. I'd imagine that sort of the backdrop here is going to leave it wide open for more foreign involvement than I think that we've seen before. I immediately think to Saudi Arabia, because I know that these two countries have a very tense relationship between the two, especially since 2005 onward. I know that Saudi Arabia had approved, Israeli incursions or military involvement inside Lebanon against Hezbollah. I think after 2006 in the conflict there. I know that in more recently, what was it in last year in December, right? That the Lebanese ambassador to Saudi Arabia, right, was he was expelled, right? The Lebanese ambassador to Saudi Arabia was expelled by the country, which has only made things even more difficult since there's been various issues with the Lebanese government. I know that they've been very tense, especially over how much aid gets sent to the country, where do their military alliances stand, which with various countries. Billions of dollars have been sent to the country and then halted because they didn't condemn X, Y, and Z. So I'd imagine that this is just going to
Yes.
be another avenue for what we call election interference.
Absolutely. Like many countries, foreign countries, are gearing up to basically flood the country with money so that their political clients win power in parliaments. And I can give you a very um, good example of this with Saudi Arabia, especially. Because I'm very happy you mentioned Saudi Arabia, because the drama between the Lebanese state and Saudi Arabia goes back. You can say yes to last year. The incident was the Saudis kicked out the Lebanese ambassador, and the Saudi ambassador withdrew from Lebanon. And the incident behind that was that one of our ministers, the information minister, who was a pro-Syrian politician, before he became the Minister of Information, was a media personality. And he was a TV host on a pro-Syrian television station, and he made comments condemning Saudi Arabia for their war in Yemen. And so Saudi Arabia brings this up as an issue after the man had been information minister for a year. And this was clearly a very orchestrated political move that Saudi Arabia needed a excuse to withdraw their ambassador and to kick out the Lebanese ambassador. And so this minister had already been in the office for a year, and Saudi Arabia all of a sudden complains that he made anti-Saudi comments because of the war in Yemen. And so the political message behind that is they were showing the Lebanese government, we are very, very unhappy with what you're doing. We're very unhappy that Hezbollah is gaining influence, that they're not decreasing their influence. And Hezbollah's influence is gaining because they are the most cohesive and stable unit politically inside the country. And so they are expanding their reach and they are expanding their influence within the country because of the dire economic situation, because they have direct funding from Iran and many other sources. And so Saudi Arabia is extremely paranoid about the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Rightfully so for their interest, because if Hezbollah gains influence, who loses influence? Saudi Arabia, and Iran gains influence, and so it's always that political power competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And there's been very, very good drama recently that all of a sudden, a couple of days ago, I think, or last week, that the Saudi ambassador made this heroic return to Lebanon, and that there's been a flourishing of relationship, and they're talking about how much the Saudis support Lebanon with this return of the ambassador. We want to help you as a country. We're willing to bring aid and everything like that. But the background to that, and like the Saudi ambassador, his name is I can't think of his name right now. But he had a dinner, an iftar, because it's Ramadan right now, with extremely important political figures in Lebanon. He had an iftar with the prime minister, and also also the anti-Syrian Christian political leaders. They were all invited to this dinner with the Saudi ambassador. And this was him conveying, one, his support for them, both financially and politically, and two, the rumor going around now is that if the pro-Saudi parties win, which is the prime minister and these anti-Syrian Christians, if they win a good result in the election, Saudi Arabia is going to throw $3 to $4 billion into Lebanon to handle their debt, to handle their imports. $3 to $4 billion is an enormous amount of money when the country is so bankrupt, and it comes with these political strings. Whereas with the IMF is concerned with political reform, financial reform, and Saudi Arabia is directly signaling to the public, support these parties, and your economic situation will improve. We're going to throw this money at you, and it will help your life directly.
Yeah, I've got on screen the Arab Weekly. They had an article from 2 days ago about the relations are being, like you had mentioned, they're to improve post election. Right? If you back us. So Walid Al Bukhari is
Yes.
he had the meeting. So he was in Beirut not too long ago, just last week. So he says the newly returned Saudi ambassadors held a series of meetings and those dinners that you had mentioned, because it is It is during Ramadan. As the first Saudi diplomatic overture after the easing of tensions, observers say the move amounts to a new chapter for Saudi-Lebanese relations and send messages to reassurances to the Sunni community, which had been preparing for parliamentary elections next May. And I noticed that you had mentioned earlier that they're seeing a decline in birth rate in comparison to their Shia counterparts. So
Yes.
I'm sure that'll play a role in here as well. And I mean, this sort of brings in the greater context of the ongoing power struggle of the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I know that so much of the Iranian headway in, say, Iraq, for example, has come out of this, the political destabilization of the country during the highlight or the peak of when ISIS was empowered from 2014 to really 2017. And that during that time, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had political operatives. They had sent men to fight ISIS, but they also had told these men to just sort of start settling in Iraq and to start having an influence there to a part where local, councils and townships are controlled by Iranians, not necessarily Iraqis, which of course are pro-Iran. So I can just see now that this election is going to be a huge determinant, at least more so on the Muslim side. This back and forth between pro Saudi Arabia, for the money, but also the Shia relationships now that we see with Iran so much. I just imagining the amount of influence that's going to play, and while at the same time, right, that Hezbollah also has its political influence, and they're probably going to play kingmaker here. I know at the beginning of this year there was already some issues because Hezbollah had made a statement. I think what's their leader's name? Nasrallah. He had said
Yes. Hassan
something.
Nasrallah.
Okay, great, cool. I got something right there. He had said something along the lines of that he was getting really tired of the Saudis importing the Wahhabist, ideology, which was primarily what ISIS was Wahhabist in nature. They didn't want that coming into Iraq. They didn't want that coming into Lebanon. They're only escalating the situations in places like Syria and Iraq, and they don't want it to come here. And I know that the prime minister had to really quickly say these guys don't speak for us, despite the fact that they kind of do speak for the government because they have so much influence.
They do, but they don't.
Okay.
Hezbollah, as I mentioned in our other stream, it's the biggest fish in the pond, but they don't speak for the government because the government is composed of half the government is composed of parties that don't like Hezbollah and that oppose Hezbollah politically. And so the government has to run everything by consensus.
Yeah.
And so even if Hezbollah says one thing, that is not an official government statement because every party has to agree on almost every government statement or the government doesn't make a statement to begin with. Because in this oligarchy, it's run by consensus. If one party disagrees, nothing happens politically and nothing gets done on the ground either.
Yeah, and as the article here mentions, it says Saudi Arabia and fellow Arab Gulf states were once major donors to Lebanon, but the relationship has been strained due to the growing influence of the Hezbollah movement inside the country. And again, I'm sure this will play a role here. These Saudi overtures pave way for a new chapter in Lebanon, but the situation remains unclear as there is a need for time to determine the strategy and approach for the kingdom. The work of the Saudi French Fund to support Lebanon, which was decided in a meeting between the Saudi foreign minister and the French counterpart, is expected to start soon. This is after the kingdom has donated $36 million through the King's Salman's Relief Center. The aid will be dispersed to unofficial humanitarian institutions. But as the article states, Lebanese political sources say that a return of Saudi support to Lebanon carries a positive signs that must first be built upon in order for I cannot pronounce that. I had to try twice now. Riyadh to restore its usual and historical role to save the country from the specter of bankruptcy. So, I mean, like we had said already now in this conversation, that we're going to see sort of that return to vote buying and election interference as well. But since we mentioned Hezbollah, one of the things I had noted, and this is something that Geopolitics and Empire, another great international relations podcast to listen to, had mentioned that the outgoing Air Force chief of Israel had stated that Lebanese airspace is no longer freely theirs to use to either attack Hezbollah targets and militants, but also to engage in operations in Syria. So I'd imagine that all of these two major, well, three major conflicts, right? The issue of Israeli Hezbollah, like that conflict has been going on for years now, and there's numerous wars that have been documented. You also have the Iran Iraq or the Iran Saudi Arabia power struggle in places like Yemen, Iraq, and now Lebanon. All on top of the fact that there's the Syrian civil war going on right next door with refugees and numerous militaries using their airspace to conduct operations. I was just wondering if you could speak on maybe some of the things that you've heard from on the ground, what you've experienced. That what role are these three conflicts now going to play, not only just for the government, but also what we might see post election?
Yeah, so on that point, Lebanon is always the battleground for all these conflicts. And
Okay.
it's the conflict between America and Russia, the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the conflict between Hezbollah and the Sunnis. There's an important point on that, but I'll get back to the to Hezbollah versus the Sunnis.
Okay.
All of these conflicts play out in Lebanon because all of these factions have their clients in Lebanon. Like I said, who's funding Hezbollah? Iran is funding Hezbollah. Who is funding the Sunni groups? Saudi Arabia is funding the Sunni groups. Who is funding the Christian groups? The West and a combination of the West and Saudi Arabia are funding the Christian groups. So all of these regional international interests are playing themselves out on this extremely tiny piece of territory to have sway over this country. And this is the tragedy of a small state in a very big pond of big players. Like Syria is a player. Saudi Arabia is a big player. Iran is an even bigger player than that. And so this is the consequence of having these regional conflicts spill over into our demographics because our demographics are very vulnerable to kinds of influences. Like Iran is majority Shiite, Saudi Arabia is majority Sunni. So it's very, very natural, very, very sad to have all these things play out in Lebanon. But it's happened for the entirety of our history, or the entirety of our modern history, I should say.
And this, I'm glad that you kind of mentioned, because this is something that I've seen a lot in a lot of commentary in other spaces where that we shouldn't disregard, or we should focus on the agency of people, or focus on like what a country is doing, because like geopolitics gets so much influence that it's so easy to throw out state agency or state players or local regional actors. And to some extent that is true. We should always pay attention to proximity, but in the world, even if you ascribe to constructivist or liberal politics in terms of how you view international relations, great powers are still going to have an influence over smaller states. And by the nature of being a smaller state, whether by population, your economy, your military strength, you do have to play the game of where do you want to go in with these alliances. And in the backdrop of all of these conflicts that are happening right now, one of the things that I'm going to I'll bounce these thoughts off of your head is just that earlier this month, Israel and some Middle Eastern allies have been discussing having, particularly between the UAE, Bahrain, and even discussions with Saudi Arabia. A summit was held in Israel about the United States, Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, and the UAE, although the Saudis and the Israelis have their own relationship. But they were talking about having a stronger security coordination and cooperation between their countries' air forces to deal with potential Iranian threats, particularly in concerns of missiles and drones. While all in the backdrop of these conflicts. And so, given how much of these pro-Syrian and anti-Syrian takes, the influence that Hezbollah has with the various parties within the Islamic section of the parliament, I I just see that Lebanon is going to is already is, but I'm in terms of violence and more. We've already seen the ongoing wars between Hezbollah and Israel. My gut tells me that we're going to see just a doubling down a lot of this great power politic influence and politicking and electioneering in Lebanon at a rate that we've just never have seen before. And the fact that that's happening with these sort of the backdrop of this, potential defense pact, the amount of, greater influence that Iran has now in Iraq, and that the Houthis are still ongoing and fighting inside Yemen, that a lot of this has the potential to spill over and be a very hot conflict, I think, if, the sort of Saudi push for aid and money in the elections doesn't pan out the way it does in May. And I'll probably have you on again post election when you get back to the States to discuss this, because I mean, you already see how much of this role here, like with Syria, for example. You have Russia, Iran, and China, and various, non-state groups, terror organizations that back the Assad regime. And while at the backdrop you have Saudi Arabia and Iran going after one another, I just my gut tells me that more people should be paying attention not only to what's happening in Lebanon, but the violent spillover is very real and likely to happen. I mean, there still hasn't been any real justice for what happened in Beirut in 2020, and there's been politically affiliated murders in, the investigation that have been associated with various terrorist groups. To me, just and I'm rambling here, and I just because I want to hear your thoughts on some of this. Is just to me, it just seems like the real likelihood now in the wake of this food issue has the real likelihood for the violence to just crank up to 11.
Yeah, that's definitely possible, and like I said before, that's always possible. Like the tragedy of these states of being a small state is you're always going to be the battleground of a proxy war. That it's very easy to say like, oh, you should, like, oh, your country has agency, your people have agency, therefore why don't you do this or that? But that's not how reality works. Like we saw that Syria, which was previously a very big regional player, that once the civil war kicked off, Syria was a proxy war, was the battleground between many factions, not just ISIS internationally, but also the Saudis, the Qataris versus the Iranians, and then the Russians got involved, and then the Americans got involved. So it's the sad fact of life that when without the proper security framework globally or even regionally, without a security framework between Iran and Saudi Arabia, without a security framework between Russia and the United States, you're going to have battlegrounds between these powers. And these battlegrounds are going to be these weak, vulnerable countries that are divided and that need support from a patron for resources, money, food, whatever it is. That once great powers get involved and give these resources to their clients, they will fight for those. They will fight for those patrons. And Lebanon and now Syria is just one of those battlegrounds, and it's sad. And elections don't change anything. I don't believe in elections. Elections don't change anything. The system is oligarchic for a reason. It's always been an oligarchy since in our entire modern history. Lebanon is not even. I don't think it can even be considered an independent state. It's not an independent state. It's always been a part of someone else's empire for 90% plus of our history, and that's just a fact of life.
And I kind of hold a similar position. Why I view a lot of the events that we've discussed now to be very tragic, in the same way that I kind of view what's happening in Ukraine to be tragic, is because there are great powers involved that have economic, political, and cultural interests in these areas. And unfortunately, it's the innocent and the people that want to defend what is their home that get caught in the violence between people that don't care. Like with Ukraine, just I feel for the Ukrainian people and I sympathize with them because you're being invaded. While at the same time, you've got a leadership that is sort of just dancing around for Western media that's backed by people that aren't Ukrainian. A lot of that has a similar feeling inside Lebanon is that you have all these people that want to live and to have families and to do well for themselves, while at the backdrop of great power politics happening at there, which is always the great tragedy of these things. But with that, we've been going now for about an hour. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up or mention in these discussions, or do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, which is not to say that there aren't local organic conflicts going on, like the local conflict between the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Christians and all these other minor factions. It's not to say those conflicts aren't organic. It's that they don't escalate to this extraordinary level without the support and without the hand of foreign powers on them. That's a crude way of saying it, but these local conflicts that are minimal and could be worked out between different groups of people kick up to much higher gears the higher up the great powers ladder you want to go.
Hmm.
And that is the tragedy of why these conflicts don't get solved, because they have to be solved on multiple levels. It's not just a local conflict between different groups. It has to be solved on the regional powers and it has to be solved on the international powers. And that's
Yeah,
just
and
sad.
it is. And the other thing that came to mind was just like selectorate theory. We talk about this in like democracies, but at the same time, this applies to foreign powers that want to have influence in other countries. Like you have to appeal to the clients that you have to satisfy in order for movements to be generated in a direction that could be, say, pro-Iranian or pro. Syrian or pro Saudi. I mean, Lebanon, I think, is a very excellent example of international selectorate theory for great power politics. Like, if Saudi or pro-Syrian movements have these industrialists, then you'll probably want to lobby a small selected base of industrialists to keep the position going and advocate for those kind of policies. This is something that could be a whole other stream discussion, right? But it just, to me, Lebanon is a good case study for how that works very much in action, like we've been talking about today, between Syria, Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah, and Iran. Is just not to discount the fact that these things have organic origins, or that they have people on the ground that fervently believe these things, but they're also great avenues to be corrupted or taken advantage of or co-opted by great powers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Hunger,
One last. Oh, sorry.
go for
One
it.
one
If you
one
had one
last
last
point.
thought, go for it.
Yeah, I can't talk about Lebanon without mentioning the 2020 port explosion.
Of course.
And yeah, so I mean that was a major event in people's lives. They still remember that. They're trauma from that. There's a I wish I could send you this photo. I'll send it maybe to you after. There's a beautiful art. There's a beautiful street paintings of the faces of the victims that died in the explosion, and I drove past it on the way from and back to the airport
Hmm.
during my recent stay there. So it's literally like 3 streets, long streets, like I would say at least a kilometer or two of the faces of the 300 victims that died that day. And what the government is trying to do now is they want to did I send you that picture of the grain silos?
Yeah, they're going to take him down.
Yeah, can you
Um,
if you can bring that up? They want to remove the site of the explosion, the grain silos, and they want to erect a monument. And
yeah, let
the
me see if I
fam
can look up the proposed monument, because you had sent that to me via Telegram.
I don't think there's a monument yet, still in planning, but like if you could send the picture of the damaged grain silos, that would be
Yeah,
great.
we can do that so people can really see what this looks like. But I mean, these are the. Let me open up see if I can get this image open, because you had mentioned that there were street paintings. I know that people had shared images. I don't know which ones you saw, but I know that, for instance, right, this has been shown around, just portraits of the people that
Yeah.
had lost their lives. But
Yeah,
let
there's
me
a
see
whole
if
it's a whole street of
yeah.
portraits.
Oh, there's probably a better image right here. Yep, from whole image of portraits. Let's share this one instead, because yeah,
And
like
yeah, this
the. Go ahead.
this wasn't a government initiative. This was just private memorials, artists volunteering and wanting to contribute to the community and remember those victims. This was not a government initiative. They weren't paid to do this. And so that was like a really good community spirit. But going back to the site of the explosion, they want to tear down the grain silos to erect an official monument, and the families of the victims are very upset about this because the investigation hasn't concluded. I
Hmm.
think there's been evidence of political meddling in the investigation, and the common rumor or common sentiment is they're trying to hide the evidence for what happened, and we still don't have all the details of what happened, even though we have even though we have good information on the explosion itself, how it happened, what was the starting point of it, why it happened is a different story.
Well, what feels like the most tragic part about that is that odds are we probably never will know.
Yeah.
Well, And I'm sure that, it's been 2 years now. I'm sure that this will play, that memory is going to play a role come next month in May with the elections.
Yeah, this is the first election in about 5 years, I would say. So this is the first post-crisis election. So it's gonna be it's gonna be wild, and I'm gonna be there. I'm excited. I'm not planning on voting because there's no one worth voting for in my opinion.
Hmm.
But it's gonna be exciting. Shit might go down, and I could be there on the ground, even though that's exciting and terrifying at the same time.
I
But
was about to
I want
say,
to, I
please
want
be
to go.
safe.
Yes, yes, yes. I want to go. I want to be there. And most likely, I'm not expecting Civil War 2.0.
Hmm.
There is very likely the chance to be street protests and violence, but I'm not expecting a Civil War 2.0. And I'm expecting to still be able to leave the country, and I'm still expecting to be able to go to the beach, have fun with friends. So like life goes on. Like, people don't think about this, but like even in war zones, life goes on. You live your daily life. You go to the supermarket, you see people, you see your friends, and yeah, you just have to be aware of your surroundings and what's going on. And so I don't expect anything to blow up that hard, even though it's a possibility.
Well, as always, right? We pray for the best, but we plan for the worst. So
Hello,
I do hope I do hope that you stay safe in when you do go over there. I hope nothing does happen to you or anything like that.
hello.
Yeah, you're still here.
Oh, you're roboting.
Oh no, well, not good. Well, the audio still seems to be good for the
Oh,
recording
I'm
though.
sorry.
So
Can you repeat that? You were roboting.
1 second, hold on. All right, how about now? Well, okay then. Well, don't worry. We lost him there real quick, but hopefully he'll come back through. But that does give us the opportunity now, at least, because this is a recording. This is our first time doing it. We can go add him back to stream now. How about now?
Oh yeah, all good. I can hear you.
Okay, great, cool. So that audio issue was resolved. Well, I think then what I was saying before the audio issues for us connection wise was just that we always pray for the best and plan for the worst. So I will pray and hope that nothing happens to you or anyone while you're over there.
Thank you. But and if something happens, I will live stream it. I will be the coach red pill of Lebanon.
Well, there you go. At least you got that going for you. You can make a name for yourself that way.
Clout chasing.
There you go. That's the Sigma male grind set we're talking about
Hmm.
here, folks.
Yes.
Well, do you have any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to add on as I move towards announcements and frog of the week?
Nope. Let's do it.
All right, fantastic. Let's go share this tab instead. Slideshow. All right, there, ladies and gents. I'll go hide us in the background here. So, for channel announcements and news, since you will be hearing this is a recording. I will be on Lampster later today, this Sunday, your wonderful Easter Sunday. I'll be live over there shortly after this stream ends. So head on over to Lambda's channel. I'll be live talking about why I talk about the things that I do. But for me and other Orthodox Christians out there, or those who are interested in that in the Eastern faith, I will have no Sunday stream next week. It will be Pascha, so I will be off and I will be celebrating the resurrection, just like you all are all today. I'm going to have a video on sort of just this idea about NEETs and political hedonism, something that's been running on my mind. I saw this image about Ivan the Terrible and his son, but it was about like the wagey and the NEET. So I kind of put some thoughts in my head. So we'll have something out soon on that. And then I'm still working on the time, but I'm on Guide to Culture. I'm with Frody on the Cameron Film Festival. I think I have like the most modern film on there. I'll be talking about 2016's La La Land because I rewatched it not too long ago, and I just noticed that there's a lot of political things or cultural moments worth talking about. And Frody and I are going to have a great discussion on that. So I will keep you all updated there. I've got about 45 minutes of real talk footage recorded, but I'm going to be focusing more on the scripted stuff instead because I've noticed that that's really where things really shine is the scripted stuff. As much as I love doing the fishing videos, they're not going away, but scripted stuff for now. And then later this month, we're going to have hopefully E.G., Evelyn Grant, myself, Praise of Folly, and Charlemagne to discuss BreadTube serves imperialism. So it'll be Prudent Reads will return. But those are the announcements that I have for now. And of course, I'll be updating them on Telegram, all the socials, and YouTube community tabs. So make sure that the notification bell is on. I think that we're seeing some slight dips algorithmically. So make sure that you're still getting notifications through. But without further ado, Frog of the Week.
We lost the audio.
All right, so inspired by our Middle Eastern discussion, today's frog of the week is the hula painted frog. This frog is, of course, found in the Hula Valley region inside Israel, once thought to be extinct since the 1950s when the lake was drained. However, it was recently discovered back in 2011. It's an incredibly tiny frog. The females are about less than 2 inches in size, but it's, of course, now inspired by its name. It's considered brightly colored in its brown spots. It's rather warty with a dark belly and some white spots underneath, but as you can tell by the image here, various forms of brown, very spotty and warty. But it's also been, told to be poisonous, so be mindful if you find one. However, how much that is true, it's still being studied. I don't think it's considered poisonous anymore by recent things that I was looking up. But its tongues are not used to catch food. It is not one of the types that will catch insects out of the air with its tongue. So definitely not the kind of frog that you're used to hearing about or stereotypically have in your mind. But that is this week's Frog of the Week. And as always, I encourage you to continue to subscribe and support the channel. As always, thank you to my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more, or $20 a month or more on Subscribestar. So thank you all very much for the support. The links are going to be in the description for Subscribestar, merch, findmyfriends.net. By all means, support your friends and support me if you can. And with that, Mr. Hunger, is there anything that you would like to shill? I know that you have a Substack.
Yes, I also have to mention, I think it's ironic that we opened this conversation with the food crisis and my name is Hunger.
Yeah, well, it all works out, doesn't it?
Dark, very, very dark. It was not intentional.
Well, that's the best part about dark humor. It never gets old.
Yes. So yes, I
kids.
do have a Substack, hunger.substack.com. I have a new Twitter account. It's about 2 months old right now, at Hunger Die. You can find me on there. And near-term plans, there's a writing competition going on for Antelope Hill. The theme is small victories. So I will be submitting a short story to Antelope Hill writing competition. And yeah, I hope to release that on my Substack if they allow me after the competition is over. And so you can look forward to that, another short story maybe in the future. And I don't have any political writing in the works. Maybe this summer, I've been doing a lot of reading, but maybe this summer I can get a handle on the Arab Spring and maybe have a reflection on the Arab Spring. That is still in the works. And I have completed my Lebanon series, so you can check that out in all four parts, my Lebanon series.
Awesome. Well, I will have your links in the description. So if you guys are interested in hearing some more on the ground stuff on Lebanon, his Substack will be there. And he's a great guy to follow on Twitter. I had the great pleasure of meeting him at the US event in February. So we have a very strong network of friends and people who can help us out and understand things. So Hunger, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciated this discussion and informing us and enlightening us. And for all of you listening to this recording, I will see you all at Lamster very soon, and I'll see you all live in a couple of weeks. So until then, happy Easter, Christ is risen, and be prudent, everyone. Take care.